And Nathaniel?
Yes, boss.
I see your hand is up. Do you want to say something?
No, sorry, it was a mistake.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm going to lower it. All right. So without any waste of time then, because we don't have a lot of time today, I just want to introduce to everyone the story of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are many other examples that we'll keep sharing as we go along. And the reason why I'm sharing this
Nathaniel?
story...
Yes, boss.
No,
sorry, it was a mistake.
Okay, that's YouTube replaying itself in the background. I'm going to close it.
All right, so without...
Okay, technical issues there. I just closed YouTube. I forgot to close my YouTube whilst I'm recording, so it's double playing itself. So I've just closed it now. I just want to connect a speaker. I forgot the speaker code. I'm going to fetch it in 2 minutes, and then I'll play this documentary about the independence of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I would like us to sit and really listen to that carefully. It's about 15 to 20 minutes. So really sit back and relax, and then I will come back talking about the readings from Nkrumah, some of the things that he's raising about what we mean when we talk about neo-colonialism. Other people call it new colonialism. And something that he argues that in the times that we live in, of course, the time that he was in the 50s, his anticipation was that post-independence of Africa, what we need to know when we study African issues is that new colonialism is seen as the last form of colonization of the African people. So I will come back in a minute just to then play that documentary, and then we'll connect in conversation. Okay, I'm ready. So this is the story of Congo's independence, and of course, it is a story that is depicted as a crisis. Amongst many other stories of crisis that Africa has gone through post-independence. It's a very, very important story in the context of understanding what we're talking about when we talk about new colonization. So I'm going to play it. Let's sit back and relax, and we will come back. Feel free to stop me at any point if you want to ask questions in between. Otherwise, we can listen to it in terms of process, because I think we have to wrap up this class around 20 past 11 or so. So we can listen to it and then come back and spend the rest of the time in conversation. Let me just check the volume. Okay, the volume is fine. Everything is good.
Line in. On June 30th, 1960, King Baudouin arrived in Leopoldville, the capital named after his great uncle, to hand over power.
Le roi Baudouin était dans une voiture découverte. Il saluait la foule, etc. Un Congolais s'est précipité sur la voiture. J'ai vu les dardes du roi dégainer. Et tout le monde avait peur, se disait il va tuer le roi. Non, il a simplement sorti l'épée du roi de sa gaine. Et il s'est mis à danser avec cette épée. C'est très symbolique, ça. C'est comme s'il lui a arraché le pouvoir.
On Independence Day, all the dignitaries assembled in Parliament. King Baudouin was to announce the transfer of power to the new government. Patrice Lumumba had just been elected Prime Minister. But the euphoria of independence did not last long. That same day, Lumumba lit a fire that spread through the entire continent.
L'indépendance du Congo constitue l'aboutissement de l'œuvre conçue par le génie du roi Léopold II.
Le discours du roi Baudouin, qui nous rappelait comment la Belgique nous a sortis de l'esclavage, comment ils ont lutté pour nous sortir des maladies du sommeil et patati patata. Ça a été un choc. Nous ne nous attendions pas à ce rappel malheureux parce que nous estimions que le roi Baudouin n'avait plus de leçons à nous faire ce jour-là. À ce moment-là, Lumumba se lève. Il n'était pas programmé comme devant parler à ce moment-là. Il se lève et il parle. Il fait un discours très militant.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais. Nous avons connu les ironies, les insultes, les coups que nous devions subir matin, midi et soir, parce que nous étions des nègres.
Rappelez-vous comment on traitait le blanc par rapport au noir. Rappelez-vous dans les écoles quelle place nous occupions. Rappelez-vous tout l'apartheid. Alors évidemment, réaction immédiate de toute la délégation d'État. Bon, beaucoup d'agitation pendant que le monde parle.
Qui oubliera enfin les fusillades où périt tant de nos frères, ceux qui ne voulaient plus se soumettre au régime d'injustice, d'oppression et d'exploitation.
C'était mal reçu par les Belges, mais nous avons tout à fait répondu à nos aspirations. Et au moment du dîner, on demande à Lumumba de présenter des excuses. Il ne s'en fait pas. Il présente des excuses en disant « Je pensais que je devais dire à cet homme des choses, je les ai dites. Donc, si ça blessé, je m'en excuse et je demande qu'on tourne la page et que nous puissions voir les choses autrement. » Mais il était trop tard. La majesté était lésée. Et la majesté lésée a décidé le soir même de se venger et tout a commencé.
Lumumba wanted to govern independently, but there were only 30 university graduates in the Congo. So it was agreed that for the next 5 years, Belgium would continue to run the important departments of the new state, including the army. The soldiers felt excluded from the newly acquired freedom.
Sabeliwe, we can see your video and the person in the background. Okay, no problem. I just wanted to make you aware. All right.
Within days, they started a mutiny, which led to the breakdown of the entire country.
The troops were roaming the streets, all armed, and it was quite a racial problem. The mutineers were there, and they had matiti, that's bushes on their helmet, which was a sign that they were prepared for action, for combat. I can remember one yelling, "Venez, venez, sale flamand. We were all dirty Flemish. That was some expression that meant you were really bad. And we're going to kill you. More and more stories circulated about killing, rape, pillage, etc. It was, if you will, the Iraq of today.
Le 10 juillet, retenez bien la date, les militaires belges ont occupé l'aéroport de Njili, ici. Ils ont organisé l'agression du Congo en disant, puisque les militaires congolais mutinés se sont attaqués aux femmes, aux enfants et aux officiers, la Belgique n'avait plus aucun autre moyen de protéger ses ressortissants que de faire venir des troupes belges, le 10 juillet. 10 jours après.
Lumumba immediately turned to the US for support. The United States had never been a colonizing power, and their democratic principles seemed to guarantee support for people fighting for independence. Fidel Castro himself had chosen the US as his first stop for support when his revolution triumphed a year earlier. But like Castro, Lumumba's attitude did not go down well with the Americans.
I was in the lobby of the embassy when this little Congolese clerk came in and he said he wanted 24 visas. He didn't know what a visa was. I said, well, do you have passports to put the visas in? No, patron. He didn't. So I explained to him what a visa was. And I said, why do you need 24? Well, he said, Lumumba is going to the States to see President Eisenhower. I said, oh, that's interesting. Told the ambassador. He said, I'm not aware of it. So he checked, and Eisenhower said, well, if he comes, I'll be here.
C'est avec un réel plaisir que je me trouve aujourd'hui aux États-Unis, pays de démocratie et de liberté, pour prendre contact avec vous.
Lumumba couldn't have made a worse impression on the Secretary of State and his deputy and other people with whom he met there. He threatened, he asked for things, including to have a woman sent around to his room.
The visit was not a success, and it was clear that Washington would not come to his rescue. Just as Lumumba was leaving Washington, Cuba announced the nationalization of US companies, and a trade embargo was immediately imposed on the island. Lumumba, like Castro, soon discovered that the Soviet Union was more than happy to help where the US would not.
À ce moment-là, Lumumba commet probablement la deuxième erreur. Ils prennent la décision, ils font un télégramme adressé à Khrouchtchev pour lui demander l'envoi des troupes de l'Union soviétique pour venir chasser les Belges. Ce télégramme, avant même qu'il ne sorte, est volé au secrétaire de Lumumba par son ancien directeur de cabinet qui s'appelait Kandolo Damien. Larry Devlin s'accapare du télégramme, les transmet au gouvernement américain.
We became aware of it almost immediately, and it came from Congolese sources. That immediately alerted the Americans. I became wide-eyed at that. I said, we have a problem here. He tried to play off the West against the East. It's an old game, but it was relatively new at that time in Africa.
Mais Larry Devlin ne l'a pas pris comme ça. Il l'a pris pour dire, voilà, la preuve est là, que le Lumumba est communiste par conséquent. Outre le fait qu'il a insulté le roi des Belges, il est communiste, donc il faut le chasser du pouvoir.
The Congo crisis was becoming more than just a local conflict in faraway Africa. The superpowers were taking a particular interest, especially Moscow, that had recently set up a bureau for aiding anti-colonial liberation movements.
The Soviet Union was eager to help
or at least agreed to help, the legally elected Congolese government that was in the last days of July, when a squadron of our EU-14 transport planes, about 10 left for Leopoldville. By the way, they landed in Athens, at the airport, which was partly NATO base. It became a big noise. The whole noise about the Cold War started when we landed there.
It was the first time that there'd ever been Soviets in that part of Africa, at least certainly not the Congo, and very few in the rest of Africa, because the colonial powers were not desirous of having the Soviets there.
Третий мир в этой войне был полем, так сказать, для охоты. Перевели вам? Полем для охоты. Почему? В Европе границы были забетонированы. Перейти границу означало начать атомную войну, которую никто не хотел. А третий мир, он был как будто без хозяина. Там была возможна свободная охота. Там можно было приобретать влияние.
We believe, and I think it's true, that it was an attempt to hold Congo as a base, especially as a base of minerals for the United States, for the West. We should not forget that the first atomic bomb was done of those uranium found in Congo.
There are only two countries in the world that supplied cobalt at that time, Soviet Union and the Congo. And cobalt is extremely important for jet engines and all sorts of high technology. And we could not get it from the Soviet Union because it was a security commodity. So Congo was our only source.
I suspect that the people in Washington began wondering where we're going to get our cobalt from if the Soviets managed to control that.
The United States deplores the unilateral action of the Soviet Union in supplying aircraft and other equipment for military purposes to the Congo. The Soviet action, which seems to be motivated entirely by the Soviet Union's political designs in Africa. I must repeat that the United States takes a most serious view of this action by the Soviet Union.
Eisenhower fumed about aggressive Soviet support for his opponents. Soviet military aid for Lumumba arrived in the Congo only 1 month after the first Soviet arms shipment had landed in Cuba. To make matters worse, Castro openly declared that he intended to use these weapons to export his revolution. Eisenhower decided to send the CIA into action.
I received a message saying that people in Washington were highly concerned about the activities of the prime minister, and that they hoped that he would go, it would be a change in the government. The next thing I knew, I received a cable saying that someone by the name of Joe would arrive in Leopoldville, and I was to take my instructions from him. And the instructions were that I was to remove him physically from with instructions. And he said, they've come from President Eisenhower. The president wanted this done, and I was to put together these poisons and bring them out to you. One of the poisons was a tube of toothpaste that had poison in it, so that if he brushed his teeth with it, that was been the end of the man. All of these things I put in my safe because I didn't want them lying around the office. If somebody may say, may I use your toothpaste? I felt that I had some pretty good operations going, and in the long term, my operations would achieve the objective of removing Lumumba from office, but not killing him.
The Congo plunged into utter chaos. In the confusion, two separate secession movements broke away from Lumumba's government. The country desperately needed to be brought under control.
The United States started to worry about it because the Soviets were backing Lumumba. So President Eisenhower said, well, we may have to use NATO there to keep the Soviets out. But finally, cooler heads prevailed, and they asked the UN Security Council to send a peacekeeping operation to the Congo. President Eisenhower made some very basic policies which are still in existence today. And he said that if there are troubles in Africa, we don't want to have to send troops there. Well, Europeans should not send troops. It should all be done by the UN.
Lumumba thought that the arrival of the UN peacekeepers would help him bring stability. He was wrong. The UN mission provided the missing ingredient to oust his government. Lumumba had just promoted his personal secretary, Joseph Mobutu, to Army Chief of Staff. Mobutu was to coordinate with the UN troops to stop the country's descent into anarchy. Instead, he turned to Larry Devlin.
Mobutu said that the army was very unhappy with the prime minister because he was turning the army over to the Soviets. He wanted to mount a coup d'etat, but there was one condition. They had to know that they would have the support of the United States government. I had tried and failed to achieve by legal means what they wanted, the United States government wanted. So I stood up and shook his hand. Finally, it took me a while to do this, and said, I guarantee you the support of the United States government. And the coup d'etat, he said the coup will take place within a week, and it did.
UN troops were supposed to protect the independence of Congo, but they wouldn't allow the Congolese troops, which were loyal to Lumumba, to operate. The mission of the United Nations troops was misused to topple the regime of the government of Lumumba, or at least not to protect Lumumba.
Les troupes des Nations Unies ici vont encercler la résidence du Premier ministre. Sans aucun mandat, sans aucune autorisation, il y a une crise interne, les Nations Unies s'interposent et vont mettre le Premier ministre en résidence surveillée.
Lumumba's supporters organized his escape. He was sneaked out of his house, bundled up in the back of a government car.
Le bruit s'est répandu, Lumumba était parti de chez lui, on a commencé à le chercher. Mobutu a demandé aux Nations Unies de lui donner des hélicoptères, on l'a poursuivi, on l'a arrêté, on les a mis dans un hélicoptère, on l'a ramené ici, ligoté, comme un vulgaire bandit.
On Mobutu's orders, Patrice Lumumba was sent to his death. It was barely 6 months since Congo celebrated independence.
C'était terrible. Vous enlevez celui qui est le flambeau, l'icône, tout d'un coup, comme ça, et d'une façon très barbare, en utilisant les mains africaines. Alors c'était frustrant, c'était écœurant, c'était un appel à l'insurrection populaire. Il faut venger cela. Ce pays est à nous et je vais me battre pour lui. C'était l'étincelle qui m'a fait conduire sur le chemin du maquis, de la guérilla.
A witch hunt tracking down Lumumba's followers started in the capital. One by one, the Lumumbas fled to the safe haven across the river in Brazzaville. They organized themselves into an armed rebellion led by the 23-year-old Laurent Kabila. Lumumba's assassination resonated throughout the world. The shock was felt clearly in Cuba, where a large percentage of the population traces its origins back to the Congo. Cuba's young revolutionary leaders were appalled. The island declared a 3-day official mourning in honor of Lumumba's memory.
Bajo la bandera de las Naciones Unidas en el Congo fue asesinado Lumumba. Y esas eran las Naciones Unidas que pretendían los norteamericanos que vinieran a inspeccionar nuestro territorio. Esas mismas Naciones Unidas.
So the story goes, briefly, that is parts of the story of the,
right this moment,
of the people of Congo. I just wanted to bring that example to perhaps, before we speak from a theoretical base, to give some practical example of what Kwame Nkrumah talks about when he talks about new forms of colonialism. And I will just briefly take you through, not a very long presentation. It's just the beginning of it, and we'll keep continuing with it. As I mentioned and I shared, that today we are talking about new colonialism, which Kwame Nkrumah considers the last stage of imperialism. And let us use the Democratic Republic of Congo as an example, as we are talking this theoretical component of it as well. So what Nkrumah then talks about, this is a book that he wrote in 1966. Actually, it was published first in 1965 and again in 1966 in the US. It means, according to him, that the old form of colonialism, like you can see in the story of the Congo, it is intended that it can no longer be possible post-independence. In other words, the colonizer is not intended to maintain his or her power to the former colony. But what you see with new colonialism is that there is a new form of colonialism that sustains itself. It continues to linger in various ways. And in the story of the Congo, there's so much going on there. Let me just make that into a slideshow so that you can see better for those who may not see. So that's what Nkrumah talks about, that this form of colonization, which is new colonialism, is actually the last stage, or his argument is that it should be the last stage of imperialism, which means that it should be the last form in which the colonizers find power in the former colonies of Africa. So in theory, what Nkrumah talks about then in this reading that I've shared with everyone is that new colonialism, theoretically speaking, Sabeli, I see your hand is up. You want to ask something?
No, I'm not asking anything with regards to what
I can't hear you. I don't know why. Can some people hear Sabeli? I see your mouth is moving, but I'm goes.
Okay, I'll just type it.
Is it me? Hello?
Hello?
I can hear you now. It was me.
Can you please ask Sibusisiwe to mute his video? Sibusisiwe, yeah.
Sibusisiwe to mute his video. Oh, I can't see Sibusisiwe's video on my site because I'm presenting. Sibusisiwe, you are requested to mute your video. I'm not sure what people are seeing.
Not the video, I mean the audio. The audio.
Oh, the audio. Oh, yes. I was wondering that maybe we're seeing things that we shouldn't be seeing. Let us be careful. We are live on YouTube, and please, can you also close our mics so that we don't interfere with background noise? And I can't see the chat because I'm presenting, but I'll try to keep up. So anyway, this is what Nkrumah talks about, as you can see in this example of the DRC. In theory, what it means, as you can see, Patrice Lumumba was literally jumping into stage. The Nice of the former colonizer, King Leopold II, arrives in Congo, and he gives this speech as if Congo is not really going through a process of independence. He comes and he wants to speak in the voice of the former colonizer. And of course, this upsets Patrice Lumumba, and he jumps and he speaks the language of freedom to the people of the Congo. So this is what Nkrumah speaks about, to say what you find is that in theory, former colonies are independent from imperialists, or at least are fighting for independence, because that independence is not given. It is always fought for. It has always been fought for. And the DRC is one example. We'll keep showing a couple of examples as we go along. People have died for this. Leaders in Africa have died, have been assassinated. Patrice Lumumba is one of them. So in theory, then, you see that the language of we are said to be independent, but actually we are not. In practice, what you see is a continuation of a trap that is political, a trap that is economical, by external former colonizers' ways of working. In the context of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba runs to the US to find assistance, to say the Belgians are refusing to give power. We need you to intervene and assist us with military power. And you can see there, as you follow the video, that the US immediately sees this as an opportunity to tap into the resources of Congo, because at that time, Congo, and even currently, Congo continues to be one of the few countries that produces cobalt. Cobalt is a mineral that is needed to produce all the kinds of engines that you see running automobile companies that produce cars and so on in the world. The Soviet Union is also another region that produces cobalt. So in Africa, Congo is the only place where you can find cobalt. And cobalt is a resource that is contributing to bigger economies in the world. All these big industries that are producing vehicles are dependent on cobalt, amongst other things, to have an engine built for a car. So you see then that the US sees an economic opportunity, and that is one of the reasons why the Belgians did not want to leave Congo, because of these minerals. Part of the negotiations in the Congo were economic, to say, if we are going to free you, we need to negotiate mining rights so that we don't lose those mining rights as we free you to be independent. And it's also, of course, then, because what is always economic is always political. If you are going to own the minerals of a country, it means that country is going to be susceptible to issues of poverty and hunger and starvation, and perhaps continue to be subjugated in certain ways. It means you're going to continue working for the former colonizers, be employed by these industries of the former colonizers, or you're going to continue producing this raw material that is transported into or outside of the country and then brought back in some form so that you can buy back. And then you are perpetually underdeveloped. So that is what Nkrumah speaks about. So when you speak, there's a difference then between what you call colonialism and new colonialism, to say it is no longer possible to have colonizers claim territory like they did during the Scramble of Africa, which is the first form of colonization. Independence is blinding us in a sense that the colonizers are leaving the territorial occupation. In many instances, they have left, but they've not left economically, and they've not left politically. So that is what Nkrumah is talking about, that is the last stage of imperialism that we see. So there are a couple of methods that he speaks about, which is not just economic. When new colonialism shows itself, these are the things that we need to look for in any system of governance of a former colony. We ask ourselves, Nkrumah says, you need to check the systems of governance, political parties, policies that are developed, when we govern countries, policies of democracy, of various systems of governance, who informs those processes, And the argument from Nkrumah is that in a new colonial system of governance, the hand of the former colonizer is always present. And the example of the DRC is a case in point, where Belgians did not want to leave, wanted to continue to militarize the people of the Congo. And military power, as we was talking in the last 2 days about, Tai was reading about at least those 4 components of what we consider African studies. And the speech of Kwame Nkrumah, when he spoke in, in one of the conferences of independent fighters, he mentioned the fact that one of the mistakes that the intellectuals of Africa made when we were going through independence was to not put a military force for the African continent. And what that did is that it maintained the military power of former colonizers. And I've made the examples of the economy. And lastly, before I open for conversation, before we wrap up, Nkrumah says what we also need to look for in the methodologies that are used for new colonialism are the financial interests, which are not necessarily specifically identifiable with any particular state or former colonizer. So in this particular instance, we could be talking about, for argument's sake, examples of China. If you look at China, China did not necessarily colonize, many parts of the African continent, but China has developed vast interest financially, have put a number of development programs on the African continent and in Latin America and other regions as well. And people are arguing to say China has become a colonizer of the African continent. I will leave it there and open the floor for any comments and questions and your take on this. And we will continue next week going deeper into the reading of Nkrumah. Please read it. But that I was introducing the idea of what it means by new colonialism. The floor is open. You, Peggy Temba, please come through.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I don't know, maybe am I audible enough?
You are perfectly audible, yes.
Okay, thank you. There is a sentence that I would like to bring forward from the reading, whereby Kwame Nkrumah says that nowadays it is no longer impossible, or it is no longer feasible to return the country that is being ruled by the neo-colonialist master. Long ago, it was feasible. Like he touches the examples of Egypt. But now I'm worried because of this statement. Is this statement made based on the period whereby Nkrumah was ousted from the power based on the coup, or he has lost the confidence that actually neo-colonialism can be actually brought out? So what was he trying to say by that? Or was he trying to say that he has lost confidence and courage in the quest of throwing the imperialist regimes, or he wrote this article after coup was orchestrated to overthrow him, funded by the imperialism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Sasko, I see your hand is up. Please come through. I don't know, Sasko, if you can hear me. I just see your name is coming up as Sasko. So I'm calling you Sasko. You could be someone else. Sasko, I can see your mic is open, but we can't hear you. Okay, we can take other comments whilst Sasko is sorting his or her audio. So, Peggy, the statement that you are talking about is right at the introduction of this reading, where, for those who have not seen it, when Nkrumah is saying the new colonialism of today represents imperialism in its final and perhaps its most dangerous stage. And he argues that in the past, it was possible to convert a country, for example, which a new colonial regime had been imposed. In other words, if a country was colonized in the past, Nkrumah says it was possible to convert that country. And he makes an example of Egypt in the 19th century, that Egypt was converted, into a colonial territory, like many of us have been. But what he says then, Peggy, is that today this process is no longer feasible. In other words, the old-fashioned type of colonialism, which was more territorial, where occupation would happen by a colonial force, and they will take over your land, take over your people, take over your governance systems, basically own that territory as theirs. And that is how colonialism of post-Berlin Conference was, when the territories were separated, the scramble for Africa happened. But his argument in the new colonialism form, he says, which is the colonialism of today, he says this process is no longer possible, in a sense that old-fashioned colonialism is by no means entirely abolished. But what you then see happening is that those who are colonizing today, they no longer take your territory, at least not in the manner that is visible in the eye. But what they are doing is they will take your systems of governance, they will take your economic power. And in some instances, that is why you find in most parts of Africa, there's a lot of contestations about land and access to land. Land occupation is still territorial, but it's not as it was in the old forms of colonization. So that is his argument. So I'm not sure whether your question is saying, did Nkrumah write this before he was ousted as a president of Ghana? Or are you talking about Patrice Lumumba in particular?
Because when I read this, because I remain resolute that Kwame Nkrumah is one of the scholars who believes in African unity. Even at the conclusion of this article, he touches that the only tool that will help us to combat this neocolonialism is based on unity. And then he goes on to say that because of the aid, some of the issues that we are facing as a continent is that aid. Because if the neo-colonial master as a hand that will control the neo-colonialist territories is by providing aid. That aid is not based on, it is not aimed at increasing our lifestyles, but it is aimed at impoverishing us. So even there is a point where he touches that our neocolonialism may not be able to exist without neocolonialist master, but it may have the ability to change masters. So is he implying that we cannot survive without colonial masters, but we can able to shift masters from we are being ruled by this neo-colonial master, then we are shifting now that we are seeing based on China, what China is doing now is offering us aid. So I don't know, because I thought maybe now from my side, I thought that maybe he wrote this article when he was exiled and his confidence and his ambitions were loosened, whereby he foresee that I made a mistake and this thing will never be foreseeable based on the neocolonialism. Because from what I think, what Robert Mugabe tried to do, the only thing that will help us as Africa is only passive resistance. Even Kwame Nkrumah himself touches that the Asian countries, what helped them was passive resistance, to resist those military bases that were placed in their territory. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a very critical point that you are raising, Peggy. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that before I respond to that question of whether we are able to survive without capital or not of the former colonizers. And it does touch on it. Nkrumah speaks about that a lot. But I'll come in. I just want to check if there are no other people because we do need to wrap up. It's 10:25, just in case other people need to go to other classes. Sasko, are you able to speak again because you had your hand up, but we still couldn't hear you? Okay, your sound is still not audible. I don't know if you are using headphones or something, but it could be your speaker arrangements.
No, Sasko is just campaigning.
Okay, so I just need to, I think it works as we keep saying Sasko, Sasko, all right.
Yeah.
It could be a campaigning strategy. Okay, so anyway, to engage with the question, I mean, Nkrumah speaks about this question, and I don't know about his psychological state at the time of writing this particular article. And, you know, there's something about the psychology of exile also, of course, that affects our emotional state and our frame of mind and politicking. And Nkrumah is one of those African intellectuals who admitted the fact that something about having studied in the United States as an African intellectual that was fighting against independence has tainted his own way of thinking about liberation of African people. I think in one of his books, Conscientism, if I'm not mistaken, which is part of the prescribed materials that I've shared with you, he speaks about this. And if you read some components also of new colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, he also touches about that. To say there is something about studying, you know, being a liberation fighter, and you are then exposed to the teachings and the education systems of the colonizer, that disturbs your way of thinking, that disturbs also dampens your revolutionary spirit. And I'm not sure whether that is perhaps, you know, something like you are saying, Peggy, that made him to think about the question of whether we can survive without capital of the former colonizers or not, and his take on that. But I will bring what he thinks. What he says about that question is that the struggle against new forms of colonialism, which are not territorial by nature, but we mustn't think that because the territory is not deliberately or visibly taken, that colonialism has disappeared. But he's saying the struggle against these new forms of colonialism is not aimed at excluding the capital of the developed world. In other words, let's take the example of the DRC. Nkrumah's version of what Patrice Lumumba has done to go and ask for assistance of the United States, to go and request the assistance of the Soviet Union, to intervene when the Belgians were refusing to give up power. Nkrumah supports that, to say we cannot entirely exclude the capital of the developing world or the developed world, I beg your pardon, from operating in our midst. But our fight and our struggle is aimed at preventing that financial power from being used in such a way as to impoverish us. So in the question of China, for argument's sake, if we read Nkrumah in the manner that he's writing in New Colonialism, he's suggesting that we cannot entirely reject investments, for example, from China or from the US or from Germany or from Britain and so on. But we need to dictate the terms of investment. Those kinds of investment cannot come in such a way that they keep us impoverished. It should be a relationship of power that is shared. And I hear what you are saying, and I mean it's open to contestation, but that's exactly what he raises there. And part of how that is possible, according to Nkrumah, is exactly how he wraps up that article to say this cannot happen without the unity of Africa, because we need to be such a power force that is able to withstand this economic power that is coming from the investments of the former colonizers. So at least in this article, that's his position and take on that.
Last point.
Mm.
Okay, he then says that the end of neocolonialism must be started by those neocolonial masters, because they are the one who will suffer the failure of it. I don't know if he's saying that people who must come to our salvation must be those who are oppressing us, but they must study this thing, because when it is combated, they are the one who will suffer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's exactly what Fanon is talking about in the pitfall of national consciousness. To say that one of the pitfalls of our national consciousness is that our African intellectuals during independence were so embedded and grounded in the ways of the colonizer, so much that some of our forefathers and our foremothers started to enjoy the benefits of this trap. And then what Nkrumah says is that it's very important, and it's a question of consciousness, it's a question of mindfulness for our presidents, for instance, our former leaders, to study carefully the struggle against new colonialism, because once that struggle is fully won, it's going to be such a pain even for our leaders, because it means also you have to be willing to give up the very same benefits of having inherited some parts of the colonizers in ourselves. And it's a struggle of the psyche, because it means we are unlearning and we are undoing the ways of the colonizer that we've internalized whilst in exile, and so on. But I mean, yeah, others can also share their views, but that is my understanding of it. I don't know how you read it, Epic. I can see Huey. Sorry, I don't see your name. It's coming as your phone. Please come through. Huey, you can speak. Okay, Huey is coming and going as well. We may be experiencing a problem of connection with others who are trying to speak. So, Prain, over to you.
Hi, I just want to ask a question. So in part of his book, he talks about non-alignment. So I just want to clarify, so is his view that, well, as you said, we mustn't accept investment on the terms of then being further impoverished. So is his view to accept investment and to accept the developed world's help, but just with non-alignment, in the sense that we can accept help and accept investment, work together, but not do it in a way that causes us to have strong allegiances to them, in the way he talks of, like, colonizers giving aid in return, they are then entitled to like natural resources and stuff like that. So it's just the issue non-alignment.
Sure. I've noted your question. Huey, do you want to try and speak? I see your hand is still up. You are dropping as soon as you want to speak. Okay, over to you.
Yes, I want to try. I want to take this conversation into a context of South Africa. For example, in South Africa, we are still using apartheid laws, and we have this thing of white monopoly capital, and we are still fighting for the land, and the economy is still enjoyed by white people. For example, black people are not given an opportunity, most of them, to enjoy the economy. So it is safe to say that South African leaders were trapped into the system that we are talking about. That is the question.
Sorry, what is your question? In the end, I missed it there.
Yeah, my question is that it is safe to say that African leaders were trapped into a system where they allowed the colonizers to enjoy the economy in South Africa, to enjoy the land, because we can find that we are having a bill in parliament now fighting that the land shall be brought back. But it is safe to say Mandela, to be specific, he was trapped into a system of neocolonialism.
Yeah, very hard questions there. I don't know. It's 10:35. I just want to check people's time. If you have to run to another class, feel free to exit. For those who are still here, we can still go on for another 10 maybe minutes or so. And I would like to open this up as well to the floor, just to check what your take is. And I think in another course, I remember, I think level 1 in political science, a lot of students were arguing that Mandela is said to have sold out, on the struggle. I would like to take you back to the speech in the context of this module that we started with Sara Kwame Nkrumah, because we are focusing on Nkrumah's work now. The speech that he delivered. When he speaks about South Africa in that speech, he actually says that African unity is not possible for as long as African countries, we allow the hand of the imperialist or the imperialists to be elevated. And he makes reference to South Africa to say, look at South Africa is the weakest link. That is according to Nkrumah. In a sense that South Africa is viewed by many parts of the African continent as a country that has enabled the staying power of the imperialists. So to respond to your question, that is what Nkrumah's take has been. And you would see when you study literature and you look at the whole history of the liberation struggle, the role of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the role of the South African Communist Party, and the whole politic of the development of the African bloc. The struggles that the African continent continues to experience about South African, what is perceived as the hegemony of South Africa as a state, mainly because, number one, there were loads of arguments when the South African Communist Party came into power to say, this is a party that is led by white people. Why is it that South Africa is allowing this to happen and influence its politics? And the very presence of whiteness in South Africa is something that is foreign to other African countries, for example, just by way of population. And when you look at the history of colonization, the entry point was the Cape of Good Hope, and of course, everything else happened, go deeper into different parts of the continent. So there's a lot of reference, even in terms of the context analysis of colonization itself and post-colonization, that in the manner that we have responded as South Africans, it has been in such a way, even in the words of Nkrumah, that does not assist the facilitation of African unity. In the politics of today is a different story. President Ramaphosa, our honorable, is now, I think, the chair of the African Union, if I'm not mistaken, and South Africa has played a number of important roles in terms of peacekeeping missions on the African continent. And of course, those questions are being asked even now during COVID-19. The people of Zimbabwe are asking now, as we are having this class, to say, why is it that South Africa is not intervening in the situation in Zimbabwe, calling on South Africa to intervene when the Zimbabwean government is attacking activists on the ground who are saying we are dying of poverty during COVID-19. So, and there's many other examples. The DRC is one of them. South Africa was there and continues to be there, And it's a long story, but I hope I'm engaging with your question, Huey, in that brief response. And there's no
Yes,
single
I'm covered.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, there are a number of scholarly contestations to that. And coming to Prain, I think on the question of non-alignment, Prain, yes, Nkrumah absolutely believes when he speaks about African unity, part of his writings, and we will get to the bottom of that at some point if time allows, that non-alignment is the way to go. As Africans, we need a United States of Africa. That basically has been his call since independence, which means that Africa needs to have its own constitution. He actually even suggested systems in place in that speech. If you can go back, I think I posted that speech on Moodle. In that speech, he proposes a something that you would call an African manifesto, for lack of a better word. But he proposes that Africa needs an African constitution, number one. So Africa needs a military zone that is of Africa. He speaks about Africa needing its own economic framework, possibly to have a currency of itself. And there's a fourth one that I can't remember from the top of my head now, but it is in that speech. I would like to send you back to that speech because he speaks about those things. So when he writes deeply about non-alignment, he speaks exactly to those things. He says, however, because Africa lives in a globe, you cannot have a non-alignment type of a situation that says, get rid of the former colonizers completely. Which is why in this introduction of the new colonialism, when it talks about the last stage of imperialism, is that you need those resources because these resources are stolen from Africa in the first place. So they need to come back in some form. But what Africa needs to guard against in the process of non-alignment is to make sure that that financial power is not used to colonize Africa further, but that power is negotiated. So he's worried about the power of the economy and the power of the financial wing of the former colonizers. Prain, I don't know if that responds to your question. I see your hand is up.
Yeah, it does clarify something. Things. I just wanted to ask, sorry, I don't know the name of the person who asked the question just after me. You said the colonizer continually enjoying our economy. What exactly does that mean? I mean, because I have my interpretation. What did you mean by that? Like, what's the definition of that?
I think that question is directed to you, Huey.
Can you please respond? Can you please repeat the question? I didn't hear the question.
You said when you're talking that the colonizer still enjoys the constitution. I mean, the economy. Are you talking about internal South Africans, or are you talking about outside powers that continuously? Are you just basically talking about internal people or outside powers?
Okay, let me clarify that point. For example, in Parliament currently, we're in a process of changing the constitution because Parliament realized that that section of the constitution do not allow, the people. It allows the minority of the people to enjoy the privilege of owning the land. So now, with that, the Parliament have realized that they need to put a new section into Parliament to make sure that majority of the people enjoy the land. So what I was meaning with that point, I was meaning that white people, for example, they are owning the majority of the land. One, owning that majority of the land because of colonialism, because of the Land Act of 1913. So how are we going to eliminate that in our post-colonialism and apartheid, where everyone will enjoy the privilege of owning the land, instead of people enjoying the land because their forefathers, colonizers, African people. So that was my point. Sorry for if you didn't understand, but that's what I was trying to clarify.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just so we have clarification. Thanks.
Thank you so much for clarifying that so well, Huey. In fact, thank you for asking Prane, because Huey, you have actually clarified the question even further, which is very, very critical, a question for South Africa in the context of post-colonial South Africa, what Nkrumah would call a new colonial Africa. In the context of land. It's exactly what Nkrumah talks about, to say what has happened with the negotiations of independence. And that is when other people feel like both people like Nelson Mandela have sold out and so on, and then the leaders that negotiated us into post-independence South Africa, which is the Apartheid government. Because you still see that exactly what Nkrumah is talking about, new colonial forms of being, where economic power still lies in the hands of the former colonizers. You know, I was in another conversation yesterday, which is still asking, for instance, the power of the Commonwealth. South Africa is one of the countries that was colonized by the British. So we fall within countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and many others, you know, India and so on, were colonized by the British. And post-colonization, when Britain left the territories, they created something that you call the Commonwealth of Nations. And the Commonwealth means that the power of England is still in existence. The power of the Queen is still in existence. How it is playing itself is something that I will ask you to check for yourselves. But that is exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. Why then is it that we still have land that is not redistributed to everyone else? And I played this clip Yaga Shaka Zulu the other day, where these questions were being negotiated between Shaka and the former and the settlers, who asked the very same questions where you are asking when land was negotiated, to say, no, Baba, can we please, come? We are visitors from Europe, but we love this place, can we stay here? And Shaka asked to say, you can't stay here, we have vast of land here. But what's going to happen to our generations if you get so used to this land and you love it so much that you're not able to share it anymore? And of course, the questions, the answers to those questions are the ones that we are grappling with also ourselves, to say that greed has kicked in. A lot of people don't want to share land equally now, and that is what the struggle is about. And Nkrumah then would call it new colonialism, for as long as those kinds of existences, because land is economy, land is a resource. If it is not shared equally, it means that we still have the hand of the colonizer somewhere, and we still have then a different form of colonialism, and that is why the land struggle continues in the manner that it does. So my phone is ringing in the background. So his argument then would be that the solution to building a united Africa is perhaps not necessarily to get rid of the colonizer in South Africa, but it would be to rearrange things in such a way that the economic power of the colonizer is not the one that impoverishes us further, but we need to negotiate in such a way that we own land, because Ushaka even made an illustration to say, is it going to be Zulu English or Zulu English? You know, and it's about, and the negotiation, of course, from the settlers were that we don't want to be crowded. And Shaka said, what happens if overcrowding happens? And overcrowding is happening, we can see it, and it's happening in ways that is impoverishing the majority. So, but again, the perspectives are yours. It's your take, it's your opinion. You need to develop your voice in this one. You need to find your own place in your argument. Like I said, in this module, there is no argument that is wrong. You have to find your political voice through the readings, do your own interpretations of the scholars. So that is Kwame Nkrumah. At the interest of time, I suppose we will leave it here. if I don't see any further questions, in preparation for next week, I will ask that, yes, there's someone talking?
Just for record, my name is not Dawa. It's Mkize.
All right, Mxolisi, live vela njengo-Huey. So please, if you can,
Yeah,
next
sorry,
time
I
when
will
you come
change
in, just change it. Yeah, Siyabonga Mxolisi. So what we'll do then next week, we will go deeper. This is where we were. We were just looking at how should we study Africa and what are the things that we need to know. There's a lot that we need to know. And parts of the story is the story that is told by Nkrumah, but part of the story is some of the examples I've shared with you about Patrice Lumumba's story and how he was assassinated in the end and why. It is about resources. It is about economic power, and we know it. South Africa is the same in the question of land and mineral resources, and Botswana is the same with diamonds. There are many examples that we can make. The same in Nigeria, in the story of oil. I'll keep showing these examples as we go along. So next week, please read this reading of Olofsson, Decolonization of the African Mind and the Intellectual Landscape. We are still sitting with the theme, then we are zoning into, but still sitting with the theme of pre-colonial, colonial state and the society of Africa. So we are sort of still in the context of this theme. If you have time over the weekend, this one is not a long reading also, like the one I shared with you from Nkrumah. It's from 130, page 130 to 146. So it is about 10, 15 pages. I will also ask you if you have time to read Nkrumah again as conscientism. Here he speaks about the philosophy and the ideology of decolonization. He goes deeper to say what kind of an ideological framework is going to assist us to truly experience what we are aspiring towards, which is decolonization. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Once again, it's always a pleasure to be here and to have these conversations. I will share, as usual, the video on Moodle. I will share the notes as well on Moodle, and we will be in touch on our WhatsApp space. Enjoy the weekend. Thank you so much.